I think sometimes it's okay to endorse and welcome and embrace. There are just normal periods of imbalance that, crazy enough, contribute to balance later.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Extraordinary Us podcast. This is Jeff Burningham in my basement at my house in the new studio with good friends talking about life. Thank you so much for tuning in. Despite our differences, we are all a lot more alike than we are different. And no matter our circumstances, we are all just ordinary people trying to do and doing extraordinary things. The purpose of this podcast is to share stories from people you may or may not have heard of to remind us of that fact. Also, and I've spoken to my guests a little bit about this the last year or so. I'm excited to talk to you about it. Many of us are slowly bleeding out emotionally. And this last year has exacerbated and highlighted that fact, I think. This podcast aims to elicit more compassion and less comparing to those around us and help us to be more emotionally whole. And today, in the podcast studio, I have a good friend of mine with me, Paul George. Paul, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here, my friend.
Let me tell you a little bit more about Paul and then tell you about how I met him. And I'm going to tell you, a little bit more about how we met because I think it's interesting. So Paul has advanced degrees in clinical social work and marriage and family therapy. He has been working with individuals, couples, and families for well over 30 years. When he started his practice, he had a full head of hair, a fro, maybe. And if you're viewing this on camera, neither of us have a fro anymore. Yeah. What happened?
We can sing Two Moons Over Miami together.
We have lost our hair, but we are still good-looking guys,
That's
if
right.
I do say so myself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But Paul has enjoyed working with, thousands of individuals, couples, families over the last 30 years. He loves helping people that are wrestling with depression, anxiety, and other difficult issues. And certainly this has been a year for that, has it not, Paul?
Absolutely. It's been especially challenging.
Why has that been? And how have people, let's jump right into that if we could. Obviously COVID-19 has been a challenge. It's been a unique year for all of us. What have you realized or what's been different over this last year for you in your practice?
Boy, I think that's a great question, Jeff. One of the, we have certain things that we just need. One of them, we need to be goal-directed. And for many people, that's often served in their career path. And so COVID has had such a difficult effect on people's livelihood, their employment, etc. And so that one important generator of being goal-directed, sometimes quarantined, etc., has really impacted that. The other thing we need is to plan and participate and reminisce pleasant events.
Yeah.
Things that are just
there haven't
enjoyable.
Been as many pleasant events, have there?
Not at all. And
No.
so, but normally people do as generators, to attend movies or activities or concerts or athletic events, etc. There's been a blackout. That hasn't been an option. And boy, that affects both depression and anxiety. And we have just a tremendous need, just like you and I have often talked, for what we call as therapists meaningful social interaction.
Yeah.
And so with COVID, we're not interacting, and we have a mask, and we're conscientious of social distancing and all those precautions. And so where people normally recharged socially, boy, that's been absent.
Gosh, that sure has been my experience. I'd say that this year has been the toughest in my life. You know me, I'm an outgoing, guy. I like to be with people, and I'm an extrovert. And you haven't been able to be with people nearly as much. What I think is interesting, my sweet wife, who you know a little bit as well, she's an introvert. And especially at the beginning, she's kind of at COVID, she's kind of like, I like this. This is like my groove. I'm like in my wheelhouse here. And while I'm pulling the rest of my hair out,
Right.
And so that has certainly been the experience for me. How have extroverts and introverts, or how have people handled COVID well versus not well? Like how have people been resilient? What are some things that you've seen that have been helpful for people or good for people over the last year? And obviously
Mhm.
for those of you who haven't caught on, we're talking about mental health today. And mental
Right.
fitness. That's what,
Right.
because
Right.
Paul and I are both physical specimens.
Oh yeah. Oh.
Now we're working on our mental fitness today. And just a reminder, in season 1, episode 9 with Johnny Hanna, the founder of Homey, great episode in season 1 of the Extraordinary Us podcast. We spoke a lot about mental health. We're reviewing that again today. Tell us the difference between people who've handled COVID well, I'm saying mentally, versus maybe not well.
Boy, that's a question we could obviously talk about a long time. But
Yeah.
one of the critical demands or expectations of this whole world is to be resilient. And one of the things that's really evolved out of COVID and the media, et cetera, is what we call scary stories, or cognitive behavior therapists like David Burns refer to those as, all or nothing thinking, negative mind reading, negative fortune telling. And some people have reacted to the worst possible scenario. We're all going to die, and this is just the front. And other people are really kind of amazing. They viewed it and reframed it as, boy, this has got some opportunities for growth.
And it certainly does, right?
Yeah.
Like I've spoken a lot about that in business and or with entrepreneurs. Whenever there's disruption, there are opportunities for growth. That I think that goes to markets in terms of entrepreneurship, but it certainly goes to personal lives, doesn't it?
Exactly. And so people that normally maybe had a primary generator, for example, pursuing their careers, some of them have learned to play the piano. Some of them learned to play the guitar. Some have had more dialogue, via the computer or phone with people they haven't talked to in years. And again, they've developed hobbies and interests, and that's been an outlet for the goal-directed part. And they seem to have done the best in terms of resilience. And then, like I mentioned earlier, our need for meaningful social interaction for many people, the time that they've spent with their own spouses or significant others, children, etc., family members that are extended, that's gone up.
Yeah, which is good, right?
Yes,
Can be good.
yeah.
But can't you? There are times, I'll say again, where my wife and I looked at each other and said, we've got to get away from our kids. Again, this is maybe in the early months when we were kind of in lockdown for months and months and months in our house. And it's like, we need to get away too, right? So there's something about space and distance, which does make the heart, I guess, grow fonder or helps us in that regard. What have you noticed with familial relationships? And obviously you've worked with a lot of couples and families and those that love spending time with each other. What is the sweet balance about spending enough time versus maybe not as much, in your opinion?
Well, that whole word balance is kind of deceptive. I think we chase this ghost that does perfect balance.
Yeah.
I think time is such a beautiful variable, and the people that seem to have been the most resilient in their relationships, especially with their spouses, they exchange what we call caring behaviors. So they have more time. They're even reminiscing times when they felt extremely close to their spouse, and they're identifying things now that they can do post-COVID or even in COVID that generates a sense of caring.
Yeah.
And the downside is some couples have been more punishing. They feel like maybe they're having these scary stories and there's financial challenges, and as they experience stress, they punish each other, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, that's for sure. Do you think balance is a myth?
I think it's a really interesting philosophical concept, because sometimes recognizing that being out of balance is a good thing with benefits later. Like I'm sure for you, Jeff, when you've been working on a major project or you've been in your education.
Yeah.
There are critics that could come along and say, holy schmoly, is that guy a workaholic, or he has so much intensity? But then you think about later, giving up something now for something better later. I think sometimes it's okay to endorse and welcome and embrace. There are just normal periods of imbalance that crazy enough contribute to balance later.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I came to see you first off when I was in a terrible episode of imbalance, and it was my own fault. I had taken on way too much. It was funny. It was 7 or 8 years ago, I think, when we first met. A good mutual friend of ours encouraged me to reach out to you repeatedly, and finally I did, which I'm glad I did. And it was because of, I guess, a lack of balance that I felt in my life that I came to you. So it is hard to know when and how much to take on. Myself, for instance, I had taken on way too much. I think this was sparked. I was in an MBA class, so I was running several businesses, starting new businesses. I think I was on 20 plus boards. I had a young family, was trying to serve in my community, and was getting an MBA. And in one of my classes, I think one of the professors spoke about incentives, or thinking about what might be exciting for you to finish a task. And I can't remember if it was like in an HR perspective or a personal perspective. But what I remember is that I started thinking about, what am I excited about? What would be exciting to me? And I shared this with you, I think, the first time that we met.
Right.
But I said, gosh, here's what I could think of. This was my little daydream during class, which scared me to death. And I kept thinking about it for several weeks, and that's why I reached out to my friend. But it was like buying a one-way ticket to I don't know where. Literally just buying a one-way ticket and just disappearing from the earth. What I mean by that is disappearing from my family that I love dearly, my children, the businesses and my business partners that I love. But I was under so much pressure and stress. And I'm sure there are a lot of people that can, recognize this and feel the same way, that I needed to escape, I guess, or I felt that way. And it scared me to death that my fantasy, my idea was buying a one-way ticket to who knows where and just sayonara to escaping all my responsibilities. So we've spoken about balance a little bit, and it is something that is tricky, wouldn't you say?
It's really a lot more complex than I think we think. And sometimes I think wonderful people read books and they go to seminars and they over-idealize that in order to have any life satisfaction, you have to have a perfect balance.
Yeah. And that just doesn't exist.
No.
There are seasons of imbalance.
Yes.
I have experienced that repeatedly.
Yeah.
When I ran for governor, that was a season of imbalance, right? However, how do you not push yourself too far? So I felt like, obviously, when I met you, when I first came to see you, I was scared because I had pushed myself too far out of whack. How do we keep ourselves in a safe zone, but continuing to grow, right? So we're growing out of our comfort zone, but not too scary or dangerous or whatever, if you know what I mean. Any advice for that? Because I think that's hard.
Yes.
That was hard for me.
It has a real valid high degree of difficulty. I think it's helpful, just like you mentioned, to have what we call a vision or a glimpse of what can be, and to stop and call time out and take inventories based on my glimpse of what can be or my vision. It's important, I think, to also measure what matters most to me. So I think one thing that I really respect about you and your strengths and your resilience is you stopped and you took this inventory and you said, boy, based on what matters the most to me, how can I set boundaries and do things differently? And it's been really kind of enjoyable for me to watch you doing that over the years. Yeah. But I think there are moments of truth where we take an inventory and we go, whoa, and so I remember one time in my life when I was working full-time and I was working on a research project and I was doing a part-time private practice. And one of my dear mentors, a great man I'll always love, put his arm around me, a great big gentleman, and he said, Paul, can I just share something with you? And I said, sure. I loved and respected this man, and he was so productive and successful. And he said, you never want to be the richest man in the cemetery. And that's all he said. And it made me just stop and take inventory again around what matters most to me. And I made a lot of modifications,
Yeah, that's interesting. Were you thinking about branching off into business or doing something different? Or was it just
I was just doing too much, I think, of the things that I enjoyed. And my father had been impacted by the Depression.
Yeah.
And his work ethic was incredible.
Yeah.
And I think I'd lost track of non-performance. And again, just the things that mattered most to me.
Yeah. What led you to this field, Paul? You grew up in Idaho, the second best state in the country, and I think it's the second fastest growing state right now. Utah is the first. I think Idaho is the second. I grew up in Washington State, so close to the Idaho border. What led you to this field? Did you always know you wanted to do this, or?
What's interesting? I always wanted to go into business.
Oh, really?
Honest. Yeah.
We should switch seats.
Yeah, maybe we should here. I had a paper route when I was 9.
Yeah.
And I was so excited, and I learned that if I got customers between one customer and another, I could triple or quadruple my paper route.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, this is the best, And,
Yeah.
And then I was hired at a young age to work in a grocery store, and I learned about business and all kinds of things. And so I actually had a scholarship to go to a college in business, and I went to the campus and I listened to some lectures, and it just didn't fit. And I just was visiting another university, and I met, things just had a fit, and I met some professors that were just amazing, and I thought, wow. I think I wanna lift people, and I thought I really love people, even though I want to use money. I think I really love people, and I will always be grateful to them. They were just wonderful mentors, and that's how it kind of began.
That's the way it should be, right? Loving people. I love people too, as you know, and using money.
Right.
Not loving money and using people.
Exactly.
I like that. Yeah, that's for sure. So, how many hours have you spent talking to people in 30 years? Have you ever calculated? Here's a business question.
Yeah,
have you ever sat down and just thought about that or calculated that?
I haven't. That'll be my assignment. I'll have to,
I'll
have to do some math on that.
I could do a quick business case and try to figure out in my head. I'm just curious, but that's a lot of time.
Right.
What have you learned? This is funny, but you spoke about some of the generators, about pleasant experiences, about being goal-directed, which I don't know if we've really spoken about that before, maybe because I don't really need more goal direction.
You are one goal-directed guy.
But I think that's really true, because I did feel coming off the governor's race, coming into COVID, I think I did feel a little lost in terms of goal direction, even though I was doing a bunch of things. What else? What are some of your other macro takeaways from 30 years loving people and talking to people from every walk of life with every challenge imaginable?
Well, that is a great question. That might be a couple chapters in your book one day. What's interesting, that has many, many facets, but when I watch incredible people that have genuine, authentic losses, and they've had trauma, and all kinds of valid, heavy, different variations of pain. One thing is they start to challenge the way that they think. So if we were to summarize volumes and volumes and volumes, they start to be opportunity and possibility thinkers.
Yeah, which is good.
It is. And even the idea of every crisis has a gift.
Mm-hmm.
So the resilient people that heal and are amazing, they're looking for the gifts in the crisis. And one thing that I've learned, Jeff, is that empathy never comes out of a textbook.
Yeah.
So some of the most empathic people have gone through their own pain. And one of the gifts in the crisis is how they lift and inspire other people.
Yeah.
And so that's been an amazing concept, and just their fight not to join the ranks of the breathing dead, you know.
Yeah. Hey guys, it's Jeff. Thank you so much for listening to the Extraordinary Us podcast. There's a lot of momentum behind the podcast right now, and we are so excited. I've got a special guest with me for a second here, my wife, Sally.
Hello, good to be here.
Why are you here, Sal?
We're starting a new podcast together, which I am super excited about. It is called Under Our Bed.
And we are literally people under our bed recording
We are
right now.
sitting right under our bed.
And if you want to hear more about why we called it Under Our Bed, tune in to our first episode, wherever you get your podcasts, because we're going to explain what it means. We hope to have candid and meaningful conversations together about issues that are relevant to you today.
Absolutely.
Good night, Sal.
Good night.
Maybe that has been the key to people who have thrived during COVID versus struggled is seeing the gift in the crisis, or trying to see the blessings or benefit in the crisis. Just that simple phrase. Are people born empathetic? I'm thinking of my wife, again, Sally, who you know, who's, maybe probably number one top skill and blessing to the world is this unbelievable empathy and kind heart. So are people born that way? I mean, can they learn it? I know they can. How do you learn empathy? I'll just tell you in my life, talking about, having to going through some hard things. It's really these hard things that have taught me more empathy, which I appreciate. There's the gift in the crisis, right? But are people just born empathetic, or how, for someone who's wanting to be more empathetic, what advice would you give?
I think part of it is again kind of pausing, sort of like as you appreciate with your competency in sports. Great coaches are looking not only at the game films of the teams they're going to play to look at their tendencies. I think wonderful human beings can learn empathy by looking at their own game films and saying, one, boy, what's it like to be these other people? And secondly, there's kind of a postdoctorate empathy that is, what's it like to be in a relationship with me? And so
that's a scary question sometimes.
Yeah, it is. So sometimes that humble inventory, it really makes a difference. And I think there are people that perhaps one of their innate gifts is they have this wide range of compassion and kindness. And that certainly plays out on empathy. But I've watched people over the years really develop it in an amazing way. I met with a client yesterday who, when I met him about 12 years ago, we wouldn't call him empathic by any stretch. He couldn't understand why it offended his wife when her father died. And he said, well, we all got to die. And it's really beautiful to see he's taking these inventories.
Yeah.
And I think really came from a place of humility and how much more empathic he is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. What are the best parts of your job? I assume seeing these people go through these transformations are one of them. That's kind of why I thought about it. But what do you love about your job? What keeps bringing you back day after day to sit in that chair and to talk to people and to hear great things and bad things and whatever.
Well, like you mentioned, I think at the beginning of this podcast, I think when we meld it down, we're all fellow travelers.
I agree completely.
And
we have forgotten that in our society right now, have we not, Paul?
I am so with you. We're so
politically in every way.
And hate and competition and comparing and what you have to be or do to be capable and lovable. And I think this idea that we're all fellow travelers. And like before I came over here today, I met with a wonderful lady. And there's really not a time that I meet with her that I don't learn something from her courage and her journey and how she handles high degrees of difficulty and just the healing process. It's pretty amazing. And I know such a huge part that I don't really have any power over, but it's amazing to watch people heal. I don't know anything more exciting.
Yeah, that's exciting. It is exciting. I think of times that I've had experiences like that. It's an exciting process to see people heal, to see people change and become better. Obviously we live in a very religious place. I'm speaking generally. There's a predominant religion here in Utah. It has a very strong aspect in our culture. By the way, Paul and I are both faithful members of that religion. But I do wonder, have you found that like faith, I think this is what you're talking about with healing. Am I going the right way?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you found overall, again, in your 30 years, that this faith in a higher power, or faith in God or a higher power is a benefit to this healing process, helps people, or conversely, does it hurt? A lot of people would say religion hurts us. It divides us. I think there's good and bad maybe in both. I'm curious your thoughts about religion based on your 30 years of experience talking to people who are deeply religious, deeply faithful, and I'm sure a lot that are not or don't believe. What are your thoughts there? What have you learned about that? It's interesting.
Boy, that is an incredible question. And again, I think maybe 4 more chapters of your book.
That's good. This is what we do here.
I believe personally, and this has played out in my experience in therapy, my conviction is that Jesus Christ is the greatest healer to walk the earth. And I don't shove a religious perspective down people's throats, and I don't try to audition to be their spiritual Swahili or anything like that. But I have really observed that if I were a neutral observer, boy, the Savior is an amazing healer over and over.
Yeah.
Independent of a person's religious affiliation or background, and often it really complements their religious perspective, again, when they get in touch with what makes them who they are and what they've grown to believe and what has served them. And it's nice because they don't have to keep so many compartments, It's like, I can really strive to be the same person everywhere. Having said that, and you and I have been blessed with some wonderful discussions, sometimes organized religion can bring a lot of shame, meaning that you better be a part of this tribe.
Yeah.
And
you got to look the part. You got to act the part. You got to, whatever that part is, you try to fit that, which is hard.
Exactly.
Because not everyone fits that part right on. Right?
And I think there's a danger sometimes. A great spiritual leader once said, looking at the New Testament, that on every block there are publicans and Pharisees, meaning just humble, good people trying their best, and people so involved in the law and the letter of the law and saying, in essence, thank you, good Lord, I'm better than these losers, etc. And so there are incredible people, I think, that are wounded deeply and even re-traumatized when the message is you're not enough and you're not capable or lovable or worthy, and you're trapped and stuck, and you'll never be enough if they're different or if they trip up. And again, I love the parable, when the Savior is hanging out with a woman caught in adultery, and that whole notion of, he is without sin, cast the first stone.
Yeah.
I think, again, like you and I have talked often, as fellow travelers, we're not equipped to throw any stones.
No.
And I think sometimes people are injured, from people throwing stones. I was working as a crisis worker in an emergency room, and this young patient was in there, and he was horribly banged up, had some compound fractures and some bruising. And I asked the CR doctor, I said, well, what happened to him? And he said, well, he made a big mistake. He was walking across BYU campus, and he said he was without sin, cast the first stone.
and he got clobbered.
Yeah,
he got laid out.
He got wiped out. And that's really not what happened, obviously.
Yeah.
But this ER doc, a member of another faith, was carrying a lot of shame from being different. And
that's
he was one of the kindest, most amazing, caring physicians I ever worked with. So I think when we pause and we say, hey, we're all fellow travelers, and again, like you mentioned earlier, returning to empathy, boy, what's it like to be them? And there's some beautiful exceptions. I had a neighbor who was of a different faith, and he was building his own home, but he also had a full-time job. And he had a deadline. He had to have so much done by Monday. And he mentioned that to a neighbor of his who was an LDS bishop.
Mm-hmm.
And he had, I guess, the whole Sunday school class go home and change their clothes on a Sunday and help them all day.
Well, that's a good way to put to work, right?
Yeah. That was kind of a neat example I often think of.
Yeah. For those of you, LDS equals Mormon or, Latter-day Saint, the predominant religion here in Utah. Before we go off the subject, I think of, obviously you spoke about Jesus Christ, and what about those of other religious, I've traveled all over the world, and Buddhists and Hindus and, Muslims, etc. What is it about this faith in a higher power that is so grounding and can be so helpful?
Boy, that is a great question again. I think just the idea that we're not isolated and there's a higher power that we can form a partnership with.
Yeah.
And that can help us when things get overwhelming and messy. Ideally, especially when the perception is from a loving higher power. And you bring up such a valid point. I learned so much from like my Buddhist clients and my Jewish clients and so on. But that conviction and belief, boy, I'm not in this alone.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that loving part is key, right? I just am looking around the podcast studio on some of the art. Love is a word that's on most of the art that we have up here. I think that's the key. I think often we don't think of a loving higher power. We think of a judgmental higher power. And hasn't that kind of been a lot of the history of Christianity, et cetera? And I think a lot of that old style thinking or whatever we drag along with us. I think it's more culturally ingrained in us and in our families that we maybe grew up in than we even recognize or realize. And that can be a detriment and that can be challenging sometimes. We have such a need to compare and compete. This is something that I've spoken about quite a bit in the podcast. We've spoken about, but this need to compare each other, to compete with each other, when again, we should have compassion for each other. We should look to lift each other. It's not about what I can get stepping over you. It's about what we can get together, kind of going together, right?
Exactly. And love is such a better motivator than shame.
Yes, and it lasts, right? I think
Yes,
I think love is the only lasting motivator.
Exactly. And it has such a long-term effect.
Yeah.
I was reminiscing the other day with a friend of mine. We went to first grade together.
Wow.
And he had the illusion that he was our teacher's favorite.
Yeah.
And I was feeling guilty because I knew I was her favorite.
Yeah.
And I think if we talked to everybody in the class,
Yeah.
umpteen years later, they all felt like they were her favorite.
Yeah.
And she just made, she invited us to really work and stretch, but we didn't ever question her love. When you came in the classroom, she smiled, she, talked to you by name, and you felt like $1 million in her class.
Yeah. I will say there's something, I'll use this word divine, when you see someone loving another person, no matter what. There's just something almost holy about that, right? It's divine. And again, that is not what we see in our world today, by and large. Isn't it heartbreaking? Do you have hope for humanity, Paul? Give us hope.
I mean,
we have to have hope, right? We're optimists. Yes. But do you sometimes drive home and we're all going to hell in a handbasket, just, you got to be down sometime. Or I would imagine, at least maybe even, especially maybe early in your career, there'd be days where you were like, whoa, give me, what's the hope for humanity? How do we come together here? How do we get better? What's going on with us?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with even sitting here in your studio and seeing the word love in so many different places. I think, this is a very simplistic evaluation, but there are kind of people on a track that I call candle lighters.
Yeah.
And they just light candles wherever they go.
Isn't that beautiful?
Exactly. And that's the high,
Let's drink some water to that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some people who are candle blower outers.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was in high school, we sang in the choir, and at Christmas time, we all came into the auditorium and it was dark, and we had our choir robes, and this was probably 5 infractions, but we had candles burning as we came in from different doors. And I was walking down the aisle, and someone in the audience blew out my candle.
Yeah, like literally
Literally
blew it out.
Physically blew it out.
It.
And I thought,
but that
what?
becomes a good metaphor in life, doesn't it?
And this neat girl behind me, and this is how she did her life.
Yeah.
Bigger than the metaphor. She said, Paul, turn around and walk backwards and I'll light your candle. And she did. And
That's
you
cool.
know, if we saw the videotapes of her, certainly in high school, but I bet her whole life, she was in the truest sense a candle lighter.
Yeah.
And I'll bet she is so happy,
Isn't that beautiful, Paul?
Yeah.
There are candle blower outers, and it is frustrating, isn't it?
Yes.
There's so many naysayers all the time.
Right. And it's just
does that feed people? What is good about saying, no, I can't really do anything, you can't do anything, or you're gonna fail at this, or the world's, terrible, or whatever the bad mojo is, or feelings. Is there any positive that comes out of that, or good that comes out of that? I've never really understood pessimism. I kind of keep going and going, even when I lose, even when I fall, when I'm broken and hurt. I try to get back up. It's not always easy. I try to get back up and get going. Is there any good from that naysaying kind of attitude? I can't think of any, but maybe I'm missing the point.
I think, as you appreciate, and boy, you've traveled the world and you've met a lot of people, energy is really contagious.
Mm-hmm.
Wherever you go, it's contagious. We stayed in an Airbnb in Queens, New York, a couple of years ago, and the lady that owned it was from India.
Mm.
And I was just sitting out in some lawn chairs in the back area, and this sweet lady from India came and sat down beside me. And in her very beautiful accent, she said to me, and I don't know why she had a need to say my full name, it was Paul George. And
George.
She said, I don't think there are many Americans that have ever really been hungry.
Yeah.
And tearfully, she told me her experience growing up in India and almost starving a few times. And then she squeezed my hand really gently. And she said how wonderful our country was and how great America was. And she had her citizenship, etc. And I think, just like you're saying, energy is really contagious. And gratitude is contagious.
Yeah.
And we know in the research, it helps us physically, it helps us emotionally, it strengthens our immune system. But when you're around someone, regardless of the race or culture, this gratitude is so contagious versus cynicism and so on.
It's one of the keys to success and happiness, right?
I believe
gratitude.
that.
That's like one of the pillars, or the pillar. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Every other virtuous, trait comes kind of from gratitude. It's
I
the
really
root.
believe that.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, again, returning back what we talked about, just the gift and the crisis.
Yeah. That story reminds me real quickly of one of the times I was in Europe. I can't remember. And I was on a business call at night, because it must have been during the workday here in the U.S. And I left. I think I was with my family, so my kids. So I left the apartment. I think it was in Berlin, Germany, maybe, and just started walking. It was a beautiful summer evening, and with my AirPods in, listening to the call. And I couldn't hear anything, but I could just see people dancing, couples holding hands, people eating. It seemed like to me in that moment, and we're both, we both love America and, blah, blah, blah. But it's funny, I texted one of my friends who had lived in Europe, and I said, are we doing it wrong here in America? Are we doing something wrong? There was just such palpable joy in the air, and it's just the joy of living. And somehow, anyways, that struck me like we're missing that sometimes in America and I'm terrible at this, in our checklists and our do this and do that and our hurriedness. We miss some of the beauty of life. And I think we can learn a lot about that from other people and other cultures, from people that are different. We all have stuff to bring to the table, and we got to respect people that think differently, believe differently, and they have a lot to teach us. No doubt about it.
That is so true. I couldn't agree more. Several years ago, my uncle was stationed in Germany in the military, and my sweet mom and I went over there, kind of a self-guided tour. And we were walking through this park, and every day at lunch, this whole crew of people that worked together in an office building had potluck lunch together.
Yeah.
And they would bring homemade bread and cheese and
Just share.
Yeah. And you could just feel their unity and harmony. And that was truly a daily thing. It's a daily occurrence.
Yeah.
And then I noticed when you went to eat in a restaurant in the evening, it was just expected that you'd be there for the evening. It wasn't hurry and eat and get mad because you didn't get your food fast enough. It was a very loving, compassionate social event.
Yeah.
And I was like you. I thought, boy, we could learn from this.
That's sure. We all have a lot to learn from. That's for sure. What makes you excited about the future? What are you excited about in your future? What are you working on and or kind of hope for the future? And before I get to that, speaking of the future a little bit, let me ask you one other hard question. Something that we've spoken a little bit about that I've been interested in. It's definitely been a hot topic here in tech circles, et cetera, but the use of psychedelics in like healing or whatever. I'm just curious, do you have any experience with that? Do you have any thoughts about that? Speaking of the future, and then circle back to my bigger question, which was, what are you excited about? What makes you optimistic, on a closing note here?
Well, very quickly, I don't have personal experience with psychedelics.
Mm-hmm. But have you read some of the research? Have you looked into it a little bit?
Yeah, and I have clients right now, in fact, that have had really positive spiritual experiences that they attribute to their experience with that. Mm-hmm. And I honestly don't know.
Yeah. I've heard that it can be helpful in treating depression or anxiety or other things like that. I mean, you've heard some of the similar things, but do you have a thought on that or a feeling?
I honestly don't know. The jury's kind of out.
Still out.
Yes.
Okay. But do you think we'll see more and more of that kind of going into the future? Is that
that's a great question. I will do
you
a little
have
more.
Become a politician here, Paul George, right now.
I will do a little more research.
Okay, so what makes you excited about the future? What are you looking forward to? What gives you hope? And
I think even through COVID and some of the scary concerns, overall people are becoming more loving. And I think there are so many beautiful examples of candle lighters. Yeah. Even last Saturday, a friend of mine went to Southern Utah University to celebrate his daughter's graduation. And they had quite a large extended family group. And they went to a restaurant. They had a wonderful meal. And the waitress came to him and said, and he said, well, give me the bill. I want to pay for this huge family of mine. And the waitress wept and she said, there's no charge. Some kind man sitting here paid for you. And I told him, that was such a beautiful thing. And he cried and he goes, actually, it was selfish. I'm feeling like $1 million today.
Yeah.
And I really believe we're going to see more of that too, even though it might not be what we capture and we talk about and we share. There is a great deal of that going on in the world, both with individuals and organizations and people doing amazing, loving candle lighting.
And do you think it's those small and simple things that matter most? Is it those, like all those small things kind of add up in this idea of kind of paying it forward, acts of kindness? Do you think, is that where it's at?
I really believe that.
Really?
I have a great conviction of that. And when I was an undergraduate, I was an assistant to a professor, and she was from Texas, and she wasn't really tall, but she was a powerhouse. Mm-hmm. Very difficult professor, and she expected you to stretch and grow, and I love her. But every Monday she would give me a pile of postcards that just had the white postcard and the stamp. And I would mail at her request about 100 of those a week. So at the end of the semester, I asked her, I said, Dr. So-and-so, tell me about this.
Yeah.
And she came up to me and she poked me in the chest with her finger, and she said, Paul George, a rose to the living is better than a wreath to the dead. And she was building every week with
Yeah.
a small act of kindness. And I don't think it was small. I don't think in terms of being a candle lighter and loving people, there are any little things.
Yeah, I love that. So you're optimistic coming out of COVID.
Yes.
You think that we're going to come out and swing for the fences and hopefully be good and healthy and
I
happy.
think a lot of good things are going to come out of this.
I think one of the good things that will come out of this, there's obviously been a stigma, right, around seeing a mental health professional.
Mhm.
And, I certainly felt that years ago before I spoke to you. Now we're just friends, right? And we talk quite a bit sometimes. Sometimes we go long stretches. I think it's been months and months since we've seen each other. The last time we got together was over lunch. You brought me a beautiful book on grace, which we should talk about as well, just grace. I love that, and I've read that book and loved it. But there's a stigma, or wouldn't you say? And my point is, hopefully some of that is falling away. Do you feel that in 2021 with COVID, et cetera? Do you feel that some of that stigma is falling away? And would that be a good thing?
Boy, that would be my best hope, that stigma would fall away, like you say. And I think the original abnormal psychology model was sick people with a diagnosis that couldn't be treated went to this great expert, and he would let them know they couldn't be treated, but he would help them to deal with it the rest of their lives. And I think neuroscience and positive psychology, that strength-based, solution-oriented, and again, this notion that certainly we want to contribute to people's toolboxes, but we want to maintain humanity and be fellow travelers, and say, as a dear friend of both of yours, you and mine, he always says, don't get caught up in your accoutrements of pomposity. I mean, boy, we're all fellow travelers, and we take off our status badges. And I would hope the trend would be not to abnormalize getting counseling or shame people that say, hey, I need some help.
Yeah, we don't do that to someone who has a physical ailment, right? Per
Exactly.
se, we have try to have empathy and compassion, but for some reason, mental health has been different. It's interesting. On the campaign trail, we spoke quite a bit about this, and the Huntsmans in particular have made a big donation. You could hear more about that in episode 2 of the first season with Jon and Mary Kaye Huntsman of the Extraordinary Us podcast. We spoke about mental health and how their family has dealt with it, and how they're making donations to hopefully help our state and our country be better. Kind of like the Cancer Institute has done for cancer all around the world. It's time for like a mental health revolution.
I couldn't agree more. And again, that brings life to people.
Mental fitness. Paul, you have saved my life on a number of occasions. You have been a blessing to me. I'm so glad that we're friends. I'm glad that you're there when I feel like I want to talk about something. And thank you for your expertise that you brought to the podcast today and just your great presence. Is there anything else you'd like to share as we wrap up, or that you'd like our listeners to know, or how to find you, or whatever the case may be? Final closing thoughts.
Well, I'm personally affiliated with a wonderful organization called Bristol Health, and they could certainly Google that.
Yep.
We have some of the most loving and amazing staff I know of, which is a great blessing for me. I would encourage every wonderful listener not to get bogged down into shame or comparing and competing, and look for the gift in the crisis and look for ways to be a candle lighter. I think that just comes back many times.
I agree. Well, you are a spiritual Swahili to me. Thanks for spending the time, Paul. It's been great. Thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been fun.
Well, thank you, sir.
See you soon. Bye. Our mental health is such a big deal, and that's something that we've been all made aware of this last year of COVID, and I think it's good that we're talking a lot more about it. I'm so grateful to have my friend Paul George in the podcast studio with me today. There were a couple things he said that I won't forget. Number one, I love how he pointed out that, the way for most of us for happiness is to be goal-directed and to have pleasant events or experiences or travel or whatever to look forward to. COVID has been hard on both those things. It's been hard to set goals. We haven't had our normal routine. No one's known what to do and where to go and exactly what goals to set in a lot of ways. I know a lot of us have gained a little bit of weight. I have, which is not a goal I had. So I love that thought. And then, of course, looking forward to pleasant events with friends, family, loved ones, travel. I'm so excited to get back out there in the world. I'm actually heading to Egypt this week with my kids, so I'm excited about that. Another thing that stuck out to me was this. He said, the ghost of perfect balance. There is no such thing as perfect balance. We seek that in our lives. We want that. It's just not realistic. I have had many seasons of imbalance in my life. When you're starting a new business, when you're starting a family, et cetera, when you're running for governor, running for office, you are going to be unbalanced. But you have seasons of unbalance that will hopefully lead to happy times of more balance. I love that thought and totally agree with Paul there. The last thing was this idea of empathy, and empathy being a muscle and something that we can develop and that does develop through experience. If we all, just in this next week, Paul talked about this, like the little things mattering. Here's your challenge for the next week. Try to display a little more empathy. Take note of when you do, write it down, keep a journal. Notice when you don't. This is with your friends, your family, your loved ones. When and how do you show empathy? And also observe when other people do. If we were all a little more empathetic, there's no doubt our world would be a better place. No doubt about it, especially in our current kind of culture and climate. This is the Extraordinary Us podcast. Thanks for listening in. See you next week.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Extraordinary Us podcast with Jeff Burningham. Please help us grow by leaving a rating and review and subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Also, tell your friends and share on social media. See you again next week.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Jeff.
And Sal.
I'm here with my wife. Why? Because we're starting a podcast together.
Yes, we are.
And it's called
Under Our Bed.
Why is it called that, Sally?
Because we are sitting under our bed right now. In this podcast studio.
Yes. And we're going to be talking about things that are interesting, vulnerable, relevant,
funny.
So check it out. Funny if you're on. So check it out wherever you get your podcast, wherever you listen to The Extraordinary Us. Look for Under Our Bed with Jeff and Sal.
Check it out.
Good night.
Good night.